The Counselor, written by Coffee Minion. Applebloom jostled her way through the crowd of ponies who had gathered for the Cutie Mark Crusaders' cute-ceañera. It was the largest cute-ceañera Applebloom could remember, spilling out over the entirety of the town square and engulfing most of what could be considered downtown Ponyville. Pinkie had spared nothing in the arrangements, somehow commandeering a troupe of jugglers to entertain the festive crowd, and lining the streets with carts full of food and games that might have been more at home at a county fair. But Applebloom's mind wasn't entirely at ease, and as nightfall approached, it occurred to her that something important was being overlooked. Applebloom found Princess Twilight sitting on a bench outside Sugar Cube Corner, smiling and looking tired as she sipped on a glass of red punch. "Hey there, Applebloom," called the princess, extending a hoof. Applebloom smiled, approached the princess, and gave her a hug. "Thanks for coming, Princess Twilight. I don't know if me and the other Crusaders would have made it this far without all your help." Twilight laughed and pulled away, smiling. "Don't be silly. Your cutie marks turned out to be different from any of the things I helped you girls learn about during Twilight Time. I just wish I would have realized sooner that your talents might relate to helping others." Applebloom furrowed her brow. "Well, yeah, that's kind of what I'd like to talk about. Didn't we have another session of Twilight Time scheduled for this afternoon?" Twilight smiled and shook her head. "We do, but you don't really need that anymore, do you?" Applebloom bit her lip. "Well, I've been thinking a lot about helping other ponies, and I wonder..." She glanced around at the myriad ponies who were dancing and celebrating. "Would it be all right if we do some Twilight Time right now? Just maybe not right here?" Twilight cocked her head. "Of course." She pushed herself off the bench and rose to all fours, then gestured with a hoof toward one of the streets leading away from the square. They walked in silence for several minutes. Applebloom kept biting her lip and looking behind them. Twilight spent more and more time just watching the filly as they walked. Twilight eventually stopped. She turned her head from side to side, checking that the street was clear. She leaned closer to her young friend. "Applebloom, what's the matter?" Applebloom startled, then stopped. She crossed one foreleg in front of the other and blushed. "Well, you know how our cutie marks came from helping others understand what their marks really say about them as ponies, right?" Twilight nodded. "I heard about you helping Diamond Tiara realize that she could use her talent for good. That was wonderful. And I remember hearing how you helped. That big fellow down in Appaloosa realized his whole life isn't stacked against him." Applebloom paused, frowning. "Yeah, I've kind of been thinking about troubleshoes for a while now, too. I just find myself wondering if it's clear to me what my mark means, and if it's like that for most ponies. Why wouldn't every pony understand and be happy with their cutie mark right from the get-go?" Twilight frowned and looked distant. "I suppose part of it is that every pony is different. But the way you're describing it reminds me of a psychological condition I studied in one of my classes. I think they called it cutie mark dysphoria." Applebloom blushed more intensely and looked away from Twilight. "Dysphoria? I've been hearing that word plenty at home since Big Mac put that dress on at the social." Twilight blushed as well. That's probably something that you and your family should talk about together in private. But dysphoria is also a more general concept studied in the field of abnormal psychology." Applebloom scrunched up her muzzle. "Abby who now?" Twilight gesticulated with her hoof, trying to buy a second to get her thoughts organized. "Abnormal psychology. It isn't a field of study I've personally focused on, but ponies who do study it and who become counselors can be very helpful to those in need. Dysphoria and other conditions tend to be more prevalent than you'd think. I mean, look at Princess Luna punishing herself by creating the Tantibus. You and I might feel a lot of compassion for her, but you know that wasn't healthy." She paused, shrugging her wings. "Even I still feel a bit off from time to time about having these." Applebloom shook her head. I don't know, Twilight. I don't like the idea of calling that abnormal, though. Makes it sound like there's something wrong with you. I mean, you, Mac, and Princess Luna are three of the ponies I most look up to." Twilight blushed again. "I'm flattered to be on that list, Applebloom, but abnormal is just the technical term. Calling a condition abnormal doesn't necessarily mean that the pony who has it is bad. It just means they're different, though maybe in a way that makes it harder for them to fit all the pieces of their life together." She smiled. "Any pony from a farm hoof to a princess can have trouble with that." Applebloom nodded slowly. "And that's what counselors can help with, right?" Twilight put a hoof around the filly's shoulder. "That's right." Applebloom beamed. "Well, shoot, I would love to do that. It'd make perfect sense with my family and Cutie Mark." She paused and narrowed her eyes at Twilight. "So tell me, have you been talking to a counselor about your wing dysphoria?" A sheepish look crossed Twilight's face. She looked about as if trying to see whether any pony might have overheard. It's usually not polite to ask other ponies about their experience with counseling. It's something very private." Applebloom's eyes widened, and her cheeks turned crimson. "Oh, I'm sorry, Princess. I didn't mean to upset you." Twilight smiled, shaking her head. "I'll tell you what, though. If you're serious about wanting to study counseling and abnormal psychology, maybe I could loan you an introductory text on how to lead a psychological consultation, and you could try it out during your next session of Twilight Time." Applebloom beamed. "Thank you, Twilight. And hey, maybe when we're done, I could try my hoof at analyzing why Big Mac has such a thing for your old Smarty Pants doll." Twilight's smile faded. "He ended up with Smarty Pants? I've been wondering what happened to her." Applebloom's muzzle twisted into a frown. I'm sorry. I just made everything worse, didn't I?" Twilight smiled. "No, Applebloom, it's not your fault. It just sounds like Mac and I have something we need to talk about, but..." She trailed off and pursed her lips. "I'll tell you what, that gives me an idea. Why don't we review a different subject before we get to abnormal psychology?" Applebloom hesitated. "What's that?" Twilight steadied herself and took a deep breath. "Conflict resolution." That was The Counselor, written by Coffee Minion. I can imagine that many of us are looking forward to what comes next for the CMC in future seasons, and considering they possess talents that can apply to a broad range of possible careers, I'm sure there are many kinds of ideas being thrown about in the fandom. But this sort of path for Applebloom seemed even more interesting than most. Not just because it's a subject that I've spent a lot of time looking into, but also because Applebloom has so many of her own experiences to draw from in helping some pony else to see things from a new perspective. I don't know what the future may hold for her, but I'd like to think she really could follow a path so very different from the rest of her family, and yet, in many ways, surprisingly the same. What do you think? I am Dr. Wolf, and I look forward to hearing from you.